Katie Morrison sat in the lecture hall of the Galactic Collegiate Institute and tried not to laugh at the horrified expressions around her. Professor Thalmic had just asked the class about environmental challenges on their homeworlds, and Katie had mentioned that Colorado sometimes got hailstorms. The Cesrid professor, whose gelatinous body rippled with concern, had asked her to clarify what hail meant. "Oh, it's just ice falling from the sky," Katie explained with a casual shrug. "Sometimes the chunks are as big as baseballs and they fall fast enough to dent cars or break windows." The lecture hall erupted in shock chittering and whistling from 24 alien students. Katie's Illyrian friend, whose feathers were currently puffed up in alarm, leaned over and whispered, "Your planet throws ice rocks at you from the sky?" "Well, yeah, but only during certain storms," Katie said, still not understanding why everyone looked so disturbed. "You just go inside and wait it out." Vexner, a Crithian student whose insectoid features made expressions hard to read, stood up abruptly and said something in his clicking native language before stalking out of the classroom. Katie watched him go with confusion and wondered if she had said something wrong. This wasn't the first time her casual descriptions of Earth had caused reactions like this among her classmates. Last week she had mentioned getting the flu as a child, and the medical students had been horrified that Earth had airborne pathogens that could kill healthy juveniles. When she tried to explain that most kids survived the flu just fine, they had looked at her like she was describing a war zone. Ben Parker, one of the other two humans in the exchange program, caught up with Katie after class and grinned at her. "You traumatized another classroom," he said cheerfully, adjusting his bag full of engineering textbooks. "I heard Vexner practically ran out. I just talked about hail." Katie protested as they walked through the pristine corridors of the station. "It's not that big a deal. To them it is," Ben pointed out. "Remember, most of these species are from what we call paradise worlds, stable climates, no major predators, gentle weather." Katie nodded slowly and thought about the briefing they'd received when joining the exchange program. 8 months ago, humanity had only made contact with the galactic community 8 years earlier, and they were still considered newcomers and primitives by most established species. Earth was classified as a Class 9 death world, the highest danger rating in the galactic catalog. But Katie had always thought that was an exaggeration. Sure, Earth had some dangerous animals and occasional bad weather, but humans had been thriving there for thousands of years. "Hey, did you hear about the field expedition next month?" Ben asked, changing the subject. "Professor Thalmic is taking the whole survival biology class to Talgon for our final practical exam." Katie's eyes lit up with excitement because field work was her favorite part of the program. "That's the moon with the canyon systems, right?" she asked. "Yeah. Supposed to be moderate difficulty terrain," Ben confirmed. Then his expression turned more serious. "But Katie, be careful around Vexner and his friends." "What do you mean?" "I've seen them watching you during labs," Ben said quietly, "and they don't look friendly about it." Katie waved off his concern because she had noticed Vexner's attention but assumed it was just academic rivalry. She consistently scored at the top of their survival biology course, and Vexner had been second place until she arrived. "He's probably just competitive," Katie said. "I would be too if someone new showed up and messed up the class rankings." Ben looked like he wanted to argue, but decided against it, and instead asked if she wanted to grab lunch at the station's human-compatible mess hall. Meanwhile, in a small meeting room 3 levels below, Vexner stood before a holographic display showing Katie's academic records. 3 other students sat around the table, all species from gentle worlds, all falling behind in classes since the humans arrived. "She doesn't belong here," Vexner said in Galactic Common, his mandibles clicking with agitation. The Deathworlders are disrupting the natural order of academic achievement. A Florian student named Cass, whose flower-like petals were tinged with purple frustration, added, "My family has attended this institute for 6 generations and never ranked below 5th in any course. Now I'm 8th, muttered Gran, a Palaxian whose rocky skin seemed duller than usual with stress. Because the human treats our most difficult scenarios like mild inconveniences, Vexner pulled up another file. This one showing an obscure galactic regulation from 70 years prior. There is precedent, he said slowly. Species deemed dangerous to the general galactic population can have their representatives removed from civilian programs if evidence of threat is documented. But Morrison hasn't threatened anyone. Cass protested weakly. Hasn't she? Vexner countered, manipulating the holodisplay to show footage from various classes. She casually describes surviving conditions that would kill any of us and treats it as normal childhood experience. The group watched in uncomfortable silence as the clips played Katie mentioning she'd broken her arm. Twice as a child, and both times it healed fine. Katie explaining that yes, Earth had large predators, and yes, people occasionally encountered them in wilderness areas. Katie, describing a camping trip where the temperature dropped below freezing overnight, and she'd considered it pretty chilly. What kind of species produces offspring that survive repeated skeletal fractures? Gran asked quietly. The kind that shouldn't be mixing with civilized populations, Vexner answered. Then his tone became calculated. The field expedition to Talgon 4 is scheduled in 2 weeks. What are you suggesting? Cass asked, though the nervous rustling of petals suggested an understanding of where this was heading. Accidents happen during field work, Vexner said carefully, especially on unfamiliar terrain with malfunctioning equipment. The room fell silent as the implications settled over the group finally. Gran spoke up with hesitation clear in every word. You're talking about elimination. I'm talking about documentation, Vexner corrected smoothly. If Morrison were to have an unfortunate accident during the expedition, it would serve as proof that even Deathworlders have limits, and that perhaps they need more stringent safety protocols before being allowed in general population programs. It was a thin justification, and everyone in the room knew it. But fear and jealousy were powerful motivators over the next week. The conspiracy took shape in quiet conversations and careful planning. Vex Nor used his family's connections to access the equipment manifest for the expedition and identified which gear would be assigned to Katie. Small modifications were made. Nothing that would be obvious during standard safety checks, but enough to ensure failures at critical moments. The survey coordinates were altered in the database so Katie would be directed toward an unstable ravine system instead of the intended survey area. Meanwhile, Katie remained blissfully unaware of the danger forming around Hirsch. She spent her time studying geological surveys of Talgon 4, excited about the opportunity to do real field work on an alien world. When Zira expressed worry about the expedition's difficulty rating, Katie had laughed and said it reminded her of weekend hikes back home in the Rockies the day before the expedition. Katie received her equipment assignment and went through her gear carefully, a habit her father had drilled into her during childhood camping. Trips everything seemed fine, and the oxygen monitors showed green across all diagnostics. Ben stopped by her quarters that evening and noticed the packed gear. You ready for tomorrow? He asked. Absolutely, Katie said with a grin. How hard can it be? Those words would come back to haunt her sooner than she could possibly imagine. The transport shuttle descended through Talgon 4's thin atmosphere, and Katie pressed her face against the viewport to get a better look at their destination. The moon's surface was a maze of rocky canyons and rust-colored plateaus that reminded her of pictures she'd seen of Mars. Atmospheric pressure is 63% of galactic standard, Professor Thalmic announced from the front of the shuttle, their gelatinous form secured in a specialized seat. Temperature range during our survey period will fluctuate between -15 and +28 degrees in your measurement system. Several students made distressed sounds at this information Katie noticed. Ben giving her a look that clearly said, "See, they think this is extreme," and she had to suppress a smile. The shuttle touched down on a flat area near the canyon system, and the group began their final equipment checks before disembarking. Katie's oxygen monitor flickered briefly during the May check but stabilized immediately, so she didn't think much of it. The sabotage had been subtle and would only manifest under specific conditions that Vexner had carefully calculated. Professor Thalmak divided the class into survey teams of 2 or 3 students each, assigning different sections of the canyon system to map and catalog. Katie noticed she was the only one assigned to work alone, directed to a deep ravine on the eastern edge of their survey area. "Is it normal for students to survey solo?" Ben asked the professor quietly, expressing the concern Katie hadn't voiced. "Morrison's academic performance suggests she can handle independent work," Thalmak replied, not noticing the quick glance Vexner exchanged with his co-conspirators. "However, if you're uncomfortable with the assignment—" "No, it's fine," Katie interrupted cheerfully, already checking her gear. "I've done plenty of solo hiking back home." Ben still looked worried but nodded and headed off with his own assigned partner toward the northern canyons. Katie reviewed her survey coordinates one last time and set off toward the eastern ravines, her boots crunching on the rocky soil. The thin atmosphere made breathing feel slightly harder than normal, but nothing her body couldn't compensate for. After a few minutes of adjustment, she activated her communication device and called in her first status report as required every 30 minutes. During field work, Morrison checking in. Entering survey area designated Echo 7. All systems green. What she didn't know was that the coordinates in her database had been altered. Instead of the stable ravine system that Professor Thalmak had selected for mapping, Katie was heading toward a geological fault zone with loose rock formations an hour into her survey. Katie noticed her oxygen monitor acting strangely. The readings would spike and drop randomly. But when she checked her actual air supply, it seemed fine. She made a note to report the malfunction after completing her survey work. The ravine she entered was deeper than expected, with walls rising 30 meters on either side and a floor littered with loose stones and boulders. Katie activated her geological scanner and began taking readings, cataloging rock formations and mineral compositions with focused attention above her position. Perched on the ravine's edge with specialized equipment, Vexner watched through a long-range scope. His face hand hovered over a small remote device that controlled several shaped charges he placed during an earlier unauthorized visit to Talgon 4. "Are you certain about this?" Cass's voice came through his private comm channel from back at base camp. "The Death Worlder needs to learn she's not invincible," Vexner replied coldly. "This will be recorded as a tragic accident caused by unstable geology." He pressed the button before his courage could fail. The charges detonated in sequence and triggered exactly the effect Vexner had calculated: a massive rock slide that came pouring down the ravine. Whilst Katie heard the explosive cracks echoing through the canyon and looked up to see tons of rock cascading toward her position. Training from countless camping trips with her father kicked in immediately, and she ran toward the only shelter. She could see a small cave opening in the ravine wall. She almost made Ida boulder the size of a refrigerator, caught her left arm and slammed her against the cave entrance, the impact driving the air from her lungs and sending white-hot pain shooting through her body. More rocks piled up behind her and sealed the cave entrance, cutting off the light and trapping her in darkness. For several long moments, Katie just lay there, trying to breathe through the pain and assess her situation. Her left arm was definitely broken. She could feel the bone grating when she tried to move it. The ribs felt bruised, but probably not cracked. And she had cuts and scrapes across her face and hands. Where smaller rocks had struck her, the cave-in had destroyed her communication device. She could feel the crushed pieces still attached to her belt. Her oxygen monitor had been smashed completely, and sparks from its broken circuits briefly illuminated the darkness before dying out. Katie took slow, controlled breaths and focused on staying calm the way her mother had taught her during medical emergency training. Panicking would use up oxygen faster and cloud her judgment, neither of which would help her survive. She carefully felt around in the darkness, mapping her immediate surroundings by touch. Cave extended back beyond where she lay, and she could feel a slight air current moving through it, which meant there might be another opening somewhere. Her survival pack was still attached to her belt, though partially crushed by the rocks. Using her good right hand, Katie managed to extract a small emergency light and activated it. Pale glow revealed she was in a natural cave system that stretched back into the rock face, with rough walls covered in some kind of mineral deposit that sparkled faintly in the light on the surface. Chaos had erupted at the base camp. Vex now arrived back just minutes after triggering the rock slide, his expression carefully arranged into shock and concern. "Professor Thalmec," he called out urgently. "I was doing elevated observations of the Western Canyon when I saw a massive rock slide in the eastern sector." The professor's form rippled with alarm, and they immediately tried to contact Katie through the communication network. Static was the only response. Where exactly was the slide? Thalmec demanded, pulling up a map of the survey areas. Venner pointed to Katie's assigned location and watched as the professor's coloring shifted to a pale, distressed hue. "Morrison was surveying that ravine," Thalmec said. "Already mobilizing emergency protocols. All students return to base camp immediately. We have a crisis situation." Ben came running back from his survey area, his face pale with worry. "What happened? Where's Katie?" "There's been an accident," Professor Thalmec explained, their voice strained. "A rock slide in the eastern ravines." Ben's expression shifted from worry to horror and then to suspicion as he noticed Vexnor standing nearby with 3 other students, all of whom had returned to camp remarkably quickly. "How convenient that you saw it happen," Ben said slowly. His eyes locked on the Crithian. "I was performing elevated observations." Vexner repeated his prepared excuse. "Right?" Ben said flatly, not believing a word but unable to prove anything yet. The rescue protocols began immediately, but with frustrating slouched out in Four's thin atmosphere, and rough terrain meant they couldn't just fly a shuttle over and scan for life signs. The ravines blocked most sensor readings. A ground team would need to be assembled, and the unstable rock would make any rescue attempt dangerous. Professor Thalmec consulted with the shuttle pilot and station authorities, and the consensus was grim. In those conditions, with that much rock displacement, survival probability is less than 3%, the pilot reported. Even for a healthy individual, the impact trauma alone would likely be fatal. "She's human," Ben insisted desperately. "You don't understand. They're tougher than what?" The pilot interrupted gently. "The reports say humans have similar physiological fragility to most carbon-based species." Ben wanted to argue, but he'd only known Katie for 8 months and didn't actually know how much punishment a human body could endure. Galactic protocols for field accidents were clear and designed around species. From gentle worlds, after 24 hours with no contact from a trapped individual, the likelihood of survival dropped to effectively 0. They would conduct a recovery operation rather than a rescue, searching for remains to return to Katie's family back on Earth in the sealed cave. Katie had no idea about the timeline working against Hurst. Managed to fashion a crude splint for her broken arm using pieces of her crushed equipment and torn strips from her uniform. The pain was intense but manageable. Though she knew infection was a serious risk without proper medical treatment, her emergency supplies included water purification tablets, a basic first aid kit, and high-energy ration bars designed to be compatible with human metabolism. Katie rationed everything carefully, knowing she might be trapped for days before rescue arrived. What she didn't know was that no one was coming to rescue her above ground. A memorial service was already being planned. 3 days had passed since the rock slide, and Katie Morrison was still very much alive. She sat in the deeper section of the cave system, carefully examining a small creature she'd caught using a trap made from her broken equipment. The thing looked like a cross between a salamander and a shrimp, with bioluminescent patches along its body that provided most of the light in the light. Katie had been watching these creatures for 2 days, studying their behavior and food sources before deciding whether they were safe to eat. Growing up in Colorado with a wilderness survival instructor for a father had taught her that patience kept you alive while desperation got you killed. Her broken arm throbbed constantly despite the makeshift splint, but she'd managed to keep the swelling down using cold water from an underground stream she discovered on day 2. The cuts on her face and hands were healing cleanly, which she attributed to the antibacterial ointment from her first aid kit and the fact that she did sterilized everything with fire from her emergency lights battery. That trick had nearly depleted her light source, but Katie had discovered the bioluminescent creatures could be kept alive in a small container and used as a sustainable light bin. Conducting survival biology field research for years and knew how to work with what nature provided. The cave creature in her hand seemed docile enough, and she'd observed it eating the same algae-like growth that covered the cave walls, which suggested a herbivore digestive system. Katie had already tested the algae itself by rubbing a small amount on her skin to check for reactions, then touching it to her lips, then eating a tiny portion and waiting 12 hours. No adverse effects so far, which meant the local ecosystem was at least partially compatible with human biology now. She needed protein, and the little salamander shrimp things were abundant throughout the cave system. Katie dispatched the creature quickly and humanely, the way her father had taught her when hunting, then used a piece of sharp rock to prepare it for cooking. She managed to create a small fire using dried plant material from the cave entrance, her light battery, and careful oxygen management. The smell of cooking meat filled the small cave, and Katie's stomach growled in anticipation. If anyone from the Galactic Collegiate Institute could see her now, they would be horrified. Most civilized species had moved beyond hunting their own food thousands of years ago, and the idea of killing and eating a living creature with one's own hands was considered barbaric. Katie just considered it Tuesday while she ate the surprisingly decent meal. She thought about her situation analytically. The cave system seemed to extend deeper into the moon's crust, and she'd heard what sounded like wind echoing from somewhere ahead, suggesting another opening. Her supplies would last another week if she rationed carefully, but her arm needed proper medical attention soon, or the fracture might not heal correctly tomorrow. She would start exploring the deeper caves to look for an exit route. Meanwhile, back at the base camp on Talgon 4's surface, Ben Parker was having the worst week of his life. Katie had been officially declared deceased after the 24-hour mark passed with no signal from her emergency beacon. A small ceremony had been held, and Professor Thalmec had recorded a message to send to Katie's family back on Earth, but Ben couldn't accept it. Spent 3 days reviewing every piece of data he could access about the accident, and the more he looked, the more things didn't add up. The equipment manifest showed Katie's oxygen monitor had passed inspection, but the tech logs indicated someone had accessed the equipment bay during a time when no official maintenance was scheduled. The survey coordinates in the database had been modified 17 hours before the expedition launch, replacing the original stable ravine assignment with the location where the rock slide occurred, and most damning of all, Ben had pulled the geological survey data for that exact location and found evidence of previous explosive charges being placed. Charges that weren't part of any official survey work. He brought his findings to Zira, who had been devastated by Katie's presumed death. Alorian's feathers were still dull with grief, but her eyes sharpened as she reviewed Ben's evidence. This wasn't an accident, Zira said quietly, her beak clicking with distress. Someone deliberately triggered that rock slide. Vexana, Ben said flatly. He had motive, opportunity, and he just happened to be in position to witness the slide. But to actually murder someone over academic rankings? Zira's feathers ruffled with disbelief. That's insane, is it? Ben countered, pulling up footage from the past semester. Look at this. Every time Katie mentioned something about Earth, Vexaner reacted badly. They watched clips of Vexaner leaving lectures, his agitated body language during labs, and several conversations with other students where he gestured toward Katie with obvious hostility. We need to take this to Professor Thalmic, Zira decided. But when they approached the professor with their evidence, they found Vexaner already there with Kess and Gron, all three looking nervous. I need to report an irregularity, Vexaner was saying to Thalmic, his mandibles twitching. I believe I may have witnessed. You witnessed yourself committing murder, Ben interrupted loudly, striding into the professor's office with Zira close behind. We have evidence that you sabotaged Katie's equipment and triggered the rock slide. Vexaner spun around, and his compound eyes reflected genuine fear for a moment before hardening with defiance. That's a serious accusation, he said coldly. Do you have proof? Ben slammed his datapad onto Thalmic's desk and pulled up the equipment access logs, the coordinate modifications, and the geological survey showing unauthorized explosive residue. Enough proof to get station security involved, Ben said. And they'll find more once they start digging, Professor. Thalmic's form darkened to an angry purple as they reviewed the evidence, their gelatinous body roiling with fury. Explain this, the professor demanded, turning to Vexnor before Vexnor could answer. Kesh suddenly spoke up with her petals trembling. It was my idea, she said miserably. I suggested we needed to do something about the humans disrupting the academic rankings, but I'm the one who planned it. Gron added heavily, his rocky features sagging with guilt. I accessed the equipment bay, and I triggered the charges. Vexner finished, his defiance crumbling. We believed that Deathworlders were dangerous and needed to be removed from civilian programs. The confession hung in the air. Like a physical weight, Professor Thalmic immediately activated their communication device and contacted station security. I'm reporting a murder conspiracy involving 3 of my students, they said grimly. Secure them immediately. Within an hour, security personnel arrived and took Vexna, Kess, and Gron into custody. The investigation expanded rapidly as more evidence came to light, and the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. News of the attempted murder spread through the Galactic Collegiate Institute like wildfire and reached the broader galactic community. Within hours, a human student had been deliberately targeted and killed by classmates who viewed her species as a threat. The political implications were enormous. Humanity had only been part of the galactic community for 8 years and was still trying to establish itself as a civilized, trustworthy species. This incident could set back human-alien relations by decades. The Galactic Council dispatched representatives to investigate and determine whether humans were indeed too dangerous to participate in standard educational programs. Meanwhile, deep in the caves of Talgum 4, Katie had no idea that she'd become the center of an interstellar incident. Spent the day exploring deeper into the cave system and had found what she was looking for: a narrow chimney that angled upward through the rock. It looked climbable, barely, though attempting it with a broken arm was going to be agony. But Katie had made her decision. She wasn't going to die in a cave on some random alien moon. Her father had taught her that survivors were people who kept moving forward even when every instinct screamed to give up. Her mother had taught her that pain was temporary and could be managed with focus and determination. Katie had both lessons burned into her very bones by a childhood spent in one of Earth's harsher environments. She gathered her limited supplies, created a rope from strips of her uniform and tough cave plants she'd found, and prepared for the climb. Before starting, she took a piece of sharp rock and carefully carved a message into the cave wall. Katie Morrison was here, and she didn't die easy. Then she looked up at the narrow chimney stretching into darkness above and started climbing on the surface. The rescue team was being assembled with new orders. Ben had convinced the authorities that even if Katie hadn't survived the initial rock slide, they owed it to her and to Earth to recover her body. The advanced scanners were being deployed, cutting through the interference that the ravines created. Nobody expected to find life signs. Nobody was prepared for what the scanners actually detected. "I'm reading a heat signature," the shuttle pilot said with confusion in his voice. "Faint, but definitely there. Moving through the subsurface cave system." "That's impossible," one of the security officers said. "It's been 6 days." "Unless it's not impossible," Ben said quietly, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "Unless she's actually alive down there." The rescue team mobilized with renewed urgency, racing against time to reach the cave system before Katie's luck ran out. Katie's fingers found another handhold in the narrow rock chimney, and she pulled herself up another half-meter. Ignoring the screaming pain from her broken arm, she'd been climbing for 3 hours and had gained maybe 20 meters of elevation. But the air was getting fresher, and she could see actual daylight filtering down from above. Her makeshift rope was tied around her waist, connected to her supply pack that she dragged up behind her. With every advance, the climbing technique she was using bracing her back against one wall and her feet against the other was something her father had taught her when she was 12 during a caving trip in New Mexico. Chimney climbing is 90% technique and 10% ignoring your body's complaints, he'd said while demonstrating the proper form. Katie wished he could see her now, putting those lessons to use on an alien moon. Her left arm was useless for climbing, but she'd figured out how to wedge it against the rock wall for stability while using her right arm and legs for the actual movement. Blood from her reopened cuts made the rocks slippery, and she had to be extra careful with each placement. Small rock came loose under her foot and tumbled down into the darkness below, and Katie froze until she was sure her position was secure. One mistake would send her falling 20 meters onto stone, and that would definitely end her survival story. Above her, the daylight was getting stronger, and she could hear sounds that might be voices echoing down the chimney. Katie gathered her strength and called out as loudly as she could manage, "Hello? Can anyone hear me?" The voices stopped abruptly, and then a response came, distorted by the rock walls, but unmistakably filled with shock. "Morrison? Katie Morrison?" "That's me," Katie shouted back, allowing herself a tired smile. "Could use some help getting out of this chimney on the surface." The rescue team stood frozen in disbelief around the narrow opening they'd found using the heat signature scanners. Ben was the first to recover, and he dropped to his knees at the edge, shining a light down into the darkness. "Katie, stay where you are. We're sending down climbing gear. he called. "Not sure I can stay here much longer," Katie admitted, her legs beginning to shake from the sustained effort of bracing against the walls. Been climbing for a while. The rescue team moved with efficient speed, lowering a proper harness and safety lines down the chimney. Katie managed to get the harness secured with one hand and a lot of creative maneuvering, then gave the signal to be pulled up. The ascent took only minutes with the rescue team hauling her up, but it felt like an eternity to Katie as her exhausted body finally allowed itself to acknowledge how much it hurt when she emerged from the chimney into Talgon 4's thin sunlight. The first thing Katie saw was Ben's face, which had gone through several shades of pale to arrive at about to cry with relief. "You're alive," he said unnecessarily, reaching out to steady her as she stood on shaking legs. "Apparently," Katie agreed, then looked at the assembled rescue team and medical personnel who were all staring at her like she'd risen from the dead. "What?" The medical team recovered first and immediately began scanning her with various devices, their expressions shifting from shock to professional concern as they registered her injuries. Broken humerus, multiple lacerations, severe bruising, signs of dehydration and malnutrition. The lead medic rattled off. "How are you even conscious right now?" "It's not that bad," Katie said, which made several of the medics exchange glances that clearly communicated they thought she was in shock. "You've been trapped underground for 6 days with a broken arm," one medic said slowly, as if explaining to a child. "That's severe trauma." Katie shrugged with her good shoulder and immediately regretted it as pain shot through her ribs. "I've had worse camping trips," she said, which was actually true. There had been that time in Montana when she was 15 and the bear incident had resulted in 3 days of survival conditions. The medical team looked at her like she was speaking an alien language, which in a way she was. They loaded her onto a medical transport and rushed her back to base camp, where Professor Thalmic was waiting with an expression that Katie's translator couldn't quite capture, but seemed to involve equal parts relief, confusion, and something like awe. "Morrison," the professor said, their gelatinous form rippling with emotion. "We thought you were dead. I got that impression from the rescue being 6 days late," Katie replied, then noticed Ben's expression. "Wait, you guys weren't looking for me?" "We followed protocol," Thalmic explained gently. "No species in the galactic database can survive those conditions for more than 24 hours. And you had no working communication device, so you just assumed I was dead?" "Statistically, you should have been," the professor said, then seemed to catch themselves. "I mean, we're extraordinarily grateful that you survived. But this raises significant questions about human physiology." Those questions only multiplied when Katie arrived at the medical facility, and the doctors got a full picture of what she'd endured. The fact that she'd set her own broken arm without anesthesia shocked them. The revelation that she'd been hunting and eating local cave fauna horrified them. Learning that she'd climbed 20 meters up a narrow chimney with said broken arm left them speechless. Most species would be catatonic from pain and trauma, one doctor finally said. "You're telling jokes and asking about your survey data. Is the data corrupted?" Katie asked with genuine concern. "I got some really interesting readings on the cave ecosystem before the rock slide." The medical staff just stared at Herbin, who had refused to leave Katie's side since the rescue. Finally explained what had happened while she was trapped: to sabotage, the conspiracy, the arrests of Vexner and his accomplices, the galactic investigation into whether humans were too dangerous for civilian programs. Katie listened to all of this with a growing expression of disbelief. "They tried to kill me because I was getting better grades?" she asked incredulously. "They were afraid of you," Ben said quietly. "Afraid of what humans represent. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard," Katie said flatly. wincing as a medic applied something cold to her cuts. "I never threatened anyone. You didn't have to," Professor Thalmek said, having followed them to the medical facility. "Your very existence as a human from a Class 9 Death world challenges the assumptions most galactic species have about survival and strength." Katie thought about this while the medical team continued their work, eventually putting her arm in a proper cast and treating her various injuries. The more she learned about galactic civilization, the more she realized how sheltered most species were. They came from worlds where the environment didn't actively try to kill them, where childhood meant safety and comfort, where broken bones were rare medical emergencies rather than inconvenient setbacks. Earth had forged humans in a crucible of predators, diseases, extreme weather, and 1,000 other dangers. Every human alive was a descendant of survivors who had outlasted everything their planet threw at them. Katie had never thought of herself as particularly tough or special. She was just a biology student who liked camping and field work, but to species from gentle worlds, she must seem like something from a nightmare, a creature that could survive being buried alive, broken and bleeding, in total darkness for 6 days, and emerge cracking jokes about the experience. "What's going to happen to Vexner and the others?" Katie asked after a long silence. "They're facing murder conspiracy charges," Thalmek said. "The Galactic Council is treating this as a serious diplomatic incident. They didn't actually murder me, though," Katie pointed out. "Through no fault of their own," Ben said with an edge to his voice. "They tried, Katie. They genuinely tried to kill you." The weight of that settled over the room, and Katie felt something cold form in her stomach. 3 students had been so afraid of her that they'd planned her death, sabotaged her equipment, and triggered a rock slide to bury her alive, not because she'd threatened them or done anything wrong, but simply because she existed and made them feel inadequate. "I want to talk to them," Katie said suddenly. "That's not advisable," Professor Thalmek began. But Katie cut them off. "I survived their murder attempt," she said firmly. "I think I've earned the right to look them in the eye and ask them why." The professor hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'll arrange it," they said. "But Katie, be careful what you say. This is still an active investigation." 2 days later, after Katie had been cleared by medical staff and gotten some real rest, she stood in a conference room facing Vexnor. Kess and Grant, 3 conspirators, were in custody, but had been allowed this meeting at Katie's requests. Security personnel stood at the edges of the room, and everything was being recorded. Vexner looked at Katie with an expression she couldn't quite read: shame, fear, and something that might have been confusion, all mixed together. "You shouldn't be alive," he said finally. "Yeah, I got that impression from the whole murder plot thing," Katie replied dryly. "No, you don't understand," Vexner continued, his mandibles clicking with agitation. "The conditions you survived, the injuries, the isolation, the lack of resources, any of us would have died within hours." "Well, I'm not any of you," Katie said simply. "Exactly," Grant spoke up, his rocky features heavy with misery. "That's what terrified us." Katie looked at the 3 of them and felt something shift in her understanding. They hadn't hated her personality, been afraid of what she represented. Katie looked at the 3 students who had tried to kill her and felt something unexpected, not anger, but a strange kind of pity. "Here's what I don't think you understand," she said slowly, choosing her words with care. "Earth made us tough because it had to, not because we wanted to be warriors or conquerors." Vexner's compound eyes reflected the conference room lights as he listened. "My dad taught me wilderness survival because Colorado has bears and mountain lions and sudden blizzards." Katie continued. "My mom taught me field medicine because accidents happen when you're hiking and the nearest hospital might be hours away." She held up her casted arm as illustration. I learned to set broken bones and treat wounds and hunt for food because those were practical skills for the environment I grew up in, not because humans are violent or dangerous to other species. Cass's petals trembled slightly as she asked quietly, "Then why does your planet have so many things trying to kill you?" "It doesn't," Katie said, which made all three conspirators look confused. "Earth isn't trying to kill us. It's just existing, doing what planets do. And we adapted to survive in those conditions." She paused and then added, "The same way your species adapted to your worlds, we adapted to ours. The difference is that our world demanded different adaptations. Gron's rocky features shifted into what might have been understanding, but the fear," he said heavily. "When you talk about your childhood so casually surviving diseases that kill, breaking bones multiple times, encountering apex predators, it sounds like a war zone. To you, maybe," Katie acknowledged. "But to me, it's just home. And honestly, I love Earth. I love the mountains and the forests, and yeah, even the occasional bear sighting that gets your adrenaline pumping." She smiled slightly at the memory. Humans don't survive Earth because we're monsters. We survive it because we're stubborn and adaptable, and we look out for each other. The room was quiet as the three conspirators absorbed this. Finally, Vexner spoke again, his voice softer than before. "I told myself that eliminating you was protecting the academic community from a dangerous element," he said. "But really, I was just afraid of being second place and too proud to accept that someone might be better than me." "Academic rivalry doesn't justify murder," Katie said firmly. "But I appreciate the honesty." She looked at each of them in turn. "What you did was wrong, and you're going to face consequences for it. But I don't hate you," she said. "I'm disappointed that your first response to meeting someone different was violence instead of curiosity." Cass made a sound like wind through leaves and said, "We don't deserve your mercy." "Probably not," Katie agreed. "But you're getting it anyway, because that's what humans do. We choose to be kind, even when we have every right to be cruel." The security personnel escorted the three conspirators back to their holding cells after the meeting ended. And Katie was left alone with Professor Thalmic. "That was remarkably compassionate," the professor observed, their form shifting to a contemplative blue color. "My mom always said that holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." Katie replied with a shrug. "Still, the Galactic Council is taking this incident very seriously," Thalmic said. "There's a real possibility they'll restrict human participation in civilian programs." Katie's expression hardened at that. "Because 3 students got jealous and violent?" she asked. "That's not fair to other humans who want to study and learn." "The Council's concern is whether Death World species create inherent danger in mixed populations," the professor explained gently. "That's ridiculous." Katie said flatly, "I didn't create danger. Danger was created when people decided I was a threat based on where I was born." Before Thalmic could respond, Ben rushed into the room with his datapad held out. "Katie, you need to see this," he said urgently. "It's gone viral across the entire galactic network." The datapad showed footage from Katie's rescue, her emerging from the cave chimney, bloody and injured, but walking under her own power. Making jokes with the medical team below it were thousands of comments from species across the galaxy, and the reactions were mixed. Some expressed horror at human durability and called for restrictions, but many more were expressing fascination, admiration, and a desire to learn more about the species that could survive what Katie had endured. "There are 17 universities requesting human exchange students now," Ben said with barely contained excitement. "And look at this, a medical research facility wants to study human healing factors. A survival training academy wants to hire human instructors." Katie scrolled through the responses and felt something warm bloom in her chest. "They're not afraid," she said wonderingly. "Some are," Ben admitted. but more curious, and that's better than fear. Over the next week, the galactic response to Katie's survival story evolved in unexpected ways. The Galactic Council convened a special session to discuss human integration, and Katie was invited to testify. She stood before representatives from hundreds of species and told her story honestly. The rock slide, the survival, the climb, and her conversation with the conspirators. When she finished, a Sessured counselor asked, "Do you believe your species poses a danger to galactic civilization?" Katie thought about the question carefully before answering. "I think humans have the capacity for danger, the same way every species does," she said. "But we also have the capacity for compassion, cooperation, and choosing mercy over revenge." She gestured to her casted arm. "I could have demanded the harshest punishment for the students who tried to kill me, but instead I chose to try to understand why they did it, because understanding prevents future violence better than revenge does." Another counselor, this one from a species Katie didn't recognize, spoke up. "Your world forged you in harsh conditions," they said. "How do we know humans won't use that strength to dominate gentler species?" "Because harsh conditions also taught us the value of cooperation," Katie replied. "Humans survived Earth not just because we're tough individually, but because we learned to work together, to help the injured, to share resources, to protect those who can't protect themselves." She paused and then added, "Every human alive is descended from people who chose to save others instead of just saving themselves. And that matters more than how hard we can punch or how much pain we can endure." The council deliberated for 3 days and finally issued their ruling. Humans would not be restricted from civilian programs, but new protocols would be implemented. Educational institutions hosting human students would need to provide cultural sensitivity training for other species and make accommodations for the significant differences in durability and environmental tolerances. Additionally, humans would be required to attend orientation sessions about galactic norms and the fact that most species couldn't casually survive the things humans considered minor inconveniences. Katie thought it was fair and signed off on the recommendations. Kess and Gron were sentenced to 5 years in a rehabilitation facility focused on addressing prejudice and violence, followed by community service. It was lenient compared to what they could have received, but Katie had spoken on their behalf during sentencing. "They made a terrible choice based on fear and ignorance," she'd said. "But people can learn and grow from mistakes if given the chance." The semester ended with Katie completing her coursework. Despite missing 2 weeks of classes due to recovery, she scored top marks in survival biology, which surprised exactly no one at this point. On the last day before students departed for break, Zira found Katie in the observation deck, looking out at the stars. "How's the arm?" the Elurian asked, settling beside her with a rustle of feathers. "Healing well," Katie said, flexing her fingers slightly. "Docs say another month in the cast." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Zira spoke again. "You changed things. You know," she said quietly, "the way people think about humans, about Deathworlders in general." "I just survived," Katie protested. "No," Zira corrected gently. "You survived and then you chose kindness. And that's what people will remember." Katie smiled at that and thought about going home to Earth for the break. She missed the mountains, the crisp Colorado air, the casual danger of a world that demanded respect, but she'd be back next semester because the Galactic Collegiate Institute had already confirmed her acceptance into the Advanced Xenobiology program. Professor Thelmick had even asked her to co-teach a course on extreme environment adaptation. "Hey, Katie," Ben said, walking up to join them. "Did you hear? 3 more humans got accepted into the exchange program for next year." "That's great," Katie said. "Meaning it," They're calling you the Death World Ambassador on the student forums. Then added with a grin. Katie groaned. Please tell me that's not going to stick. Oh, it's absolutely going to stick, Zira said, her beak clicking with amusement. 6 months later, Katie stood at the front of a classroom filled with alien students, all of whom looked nervous and excited in equal measure. Welcome to Extreme Environment Survival Techniques, she said, smiling at the sea of diverse faces. I'm Katie Morrison, and yes, I'm from Earth. A few students shifted uncomfortably at that. Before we start, let me make one thing clear, Katie continued. This course isn't about proving humans are tougher than everyone else or making you feel inadequate. She pulled up a holographic display showing various hostile environments. It's about understanding that survival isn't about being the strongest,